Hi friends, today I'd like to share with you how I work the invisible and stretchy sewn bind off. The purpose of this bind off is that your knitting will look as if the knit stitches wrap up and around the fabric without a bind off edge. We achieve this bind off by using a darning needle and cutting our tail after you've finished the length of ribbing as written in the pattern. You will cut a tail that is 4 times the circumference of your project. In this case, I'm working on a hat. So we have a few setup steps that we need to do before we begin our sewn bind off. First, let's discuss what I mean by stitch number 1 and stitch number 2. And for the purpose of this project, I'd like to explain that stitch number 1 is this one right here. It's the stitch that's closest to the edge of your needle. Stitch number 2 is going to be the stitch that's directly to the left of it. Now, as we bind off these stitches, for example, after stitch number 1 is bound off, the next stitch becomes stitch number 1 and 2. During this process, we are going to be binding off 2 stitches every time we repeat the 5 steps. Now, the setup steps are number 1 says insert the needle purlwise into stitch 1 and leave on. So here is my darning needle and I'm going to insert the needle from right to left purlwise into stitch number 1 and I'm going to pull it through. Now because my tail is pretty long, it may get tangly, just be patient with it. There we are, and I gave it a little tug, okay? I left it on, meaning I didn't drop it off of the needle. Setup step number 2 is insert the needle purlwise in between stitches 1 and 2. So I'm going to look at my work from above here, and I'm going to insert my darning needle in between stitches number 1 and 2, meaning I'm not going into either stitch. I'm just going back to front in between these 2 stitches and pulling the yarn through. Again, it may get tangly, just be patient. Setup step number 3, insert the needle knitwise into stitch number 2 and leave on. So here's stitch number 1, here's stitch number 2. I'm inserting the needle from left to right, that's knitwise, as if to knit, and pulling the yarn through. Again, I'm leaving it on the needles, not pulling it off of the needles at this time. Those are our 3 setup steps. Are you ready for the 5-step repeat? Let's begin. Step number 1. Insert your needle knitwise into stitch 1 and slip it off. So this is stitch number 1. I'm inserting it knitwise from left to right, and I'm going to slip it off the needle and pull my yarn through. Very good. Step number 2, insert your needle purlwise into stitch 2 and leave on. I now have a new stitch 1 and stitch 2. So I'm going to insert my needle purlwise from right to left as if to purl. And I'm going to leave that stitch on the working needles. Excuse me. Ooh, okay. There we go. Step number 3, insert your needle purlwise into stitch 1 and slip it off. So here we go, from right to left as if to purl and slip it off. Pull it through. And there, we just bound off 2 stitches. The next step is, step number 4 is insert your needle purlwise in between stitches 1 and 2. So here's my stitch 1 and stitch 2, and I'm going to insert the needle in between the 2 stitches and pull that yarn through. Very good. And the last step, step number 5, is insert your needle knitwise into stitch 2 and leave it on. After you've done this multiple times, you will get it and you will remember it. But here's my tip. If you need to walk away from your work, let's say you don't get to finish the entire bind off, then I suggest that you finish the 5 steps, the 5-step repeat, before you walk away. This way, every time you come back to your work, you know you're at the beginning of the 5-step repeat. So I think what we should do now for the last repeat that we're going to do together, I think we should do it in the way that I do it in my head. And what I do is I kind of sing myself a song that helps me to remember where I'm at and what I'm doing, but I'm doing it in an abbreviated way. Knit 1 off. Purl 2 on. Purl 1 off. Purl between. Knit 2 on. What did you think about that? In my head, it's kind of musical. Please continue. I'll leave you here. Please continue working the 5-step repeat until you get to the very last 2 stitches. You should finish all 5 steps and still have 2 stitches left on your needles. Then I will come back and tell you how to finish off those last 2 stitches, and it will be completely seamless. But what I have left is these 2 stitches on the needle. And what I'm going to do is I need to work the 5-step repeat one more time in order to bind off these last 2 stitches, and the goal is to make it seamless with this first knit stitch that we bound off. I have both legs of the knit stitch there. Okay, so let's work through the 5 steps. Step number 1 is to knit 1 off. So I'm going to move my stitches to the end of the knitting needle, insert my darning needle knitwise from left to right, and slip it off. Perfect. The next step is to purl 2 on. Now, I don't have a second stitch here. I don't have stitch number 2. So I am going to insert my darning needle into the right leg. Can you see where I'm picking up here? It's the right leg of the first stitch that we bound off. I'm going into it purlwise, and that step is purl 2 on, so it will stay on. Step number 3 is purl 1 off. So I am going to insert my needle into stitch number 1 purlwise and take it off the needle so I can get rid of this completely now. And pull your yarn through. Step number 4 is purl between. But we no longer have a knitting needle to work on, so there's nothing to go in between. Step number 5, we're gonna skip step number 4, purl between, and we're gonna go to step number 5, and that says knit 2 on. So since we don't have another stitch to work into, we're going to enter the left leg of the first stitch that we bound off right here. We've already purled into this one. We are going to knit into this one as step number 5. Let's see if I can catch it carefully. There we go. And let's see how this looks. Does it look tidy is the question. Aha. It looks beautiful. Great. Your work is perfectly seamless, and we made a connection so that there is no jog between the last and the first stitch.